Welcome to Proof of PR, your passport to the world of public relations for Bitcoin and Web3. I'm your host, Kelley Weaver, CEO of Melrose PR, the leading provider of communications and PR strategy in our unique industry. Get ready for an inside look into the future of finance, technology, and entrepreneurship from those driving innovation in the space. Join us as we learn how they generate headlines, cut through the noise, and grow their brand awareness through media placements, press mentions, and thought leadership. These are the stories behind their success. This is Proof of PR. Today I'm joined by Abram Smith, who is a vice president at Greenbrier, and he's been part of the Greenbrier team since the beginning, and he leads the firm's crypto practice. Welcome, Abram.
Hi, Kelley. Thanks for having me. Congrats on relaunching the podcast.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to have you on today because we've worked together on a few different clients. Whenever there's an acute crisis that crosses our desks, we immediately think of you and your team because you are such experts in the field of crisis communications. And so I'm excited to dive in, learn a little bit more about your background, and educate folks in how they can navigate these crises. And I've really appreciated our partnership.
Well, thank you. We do as well. Really excited for this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got into this field of crisis comms in the first place?
I think it starts way back in my youth. So my family has been steeped in politics for multiple generations, both as candidates and strategists. And so comms is, of course, a huge part of that world. And that means that I've been discussing and learning the craft as far back as I can remember. Like a typical dinner conversation was talking about the strategy, tactics, messaging, optics, what works, what doesn't, why. And so I was pretty dead set in going into politics, just kind of following the family lineage. And that is until I was thrown into the crypto deep end in 2013, where right out of college, essentially, I did comms for a large exchange that was peripheral, but certainly involved in the media cycle in a positive way. Related to the Mt. Gox collapse. And after that experience, I thought, that was it. I'm all in on crypto. Don't really care about anything else career-wise. I'm going to figure out how to get involved in the space, read up on everything I could get my hands on, and the rest would be history. But then I had this opportunity to work at Uber during their frontier days, where it was still legalizing its business model across the US and globally. So I was essentially a policy and communications hybrid, and my territory was the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, of course, mainly Portland and Seattle. And I think that's where the crisis comms muscle was really built. We were kind of responsible for like delivering kittens in cars, doing policy work, but then also when anything bad happened in a car, that was on us, like the point person for that territory. And it's one of those things where we all, understand that ride sharing is generally pretty safe, but when you have millions of peer-to-peer interactions with strangers every day, there's going to be a handful of things that go wrong. And because ride sharing was so early in its tech arc, anytime something went wrong, it was a kind of a full-blown crisis that swept all throughout the local and regional media, and we were kind of the point people to handle that. So after 2 years at Uber, I was a founding team member at Greenbrier, actually, with my former bosses at Uber. And we started as a crisis firm, just given that is really the experience that we built up during our time at Uber. And 7 years later, now we're a full stack corporate strategy, communications, and public affairs firm. But we still do know how to deal with a crisis. It's in our roots, and right, it's one of those things where if we're working proactively with a client and something goes wrong, like it's good that we're there, but we also still do acute crisis management where if something is going sideways, we're always happy to be that red phone line at 2 a.m, where you can call us and we'll jump in and work as quickly and efficiently as possible to get you through it.
I'm so grateful for that because sometimes these things are definitely in the, crazy hours of the day and weekends and all of that. You never can plan for this. And you have always been sort of a phone call away whenever we need that. So thank you.
Well, we're always happy to take those phone calls, especially in our space. A lot can happen fast. And at all hours of the day, night, day of the week, doesn't really matter. Holidays. In fact, I find that during off hours, that's when some of the bad actors are not at their day jobs and they're able to really wreak havoc.
Well, so you mentioned that you worked in, you got bit by the crypto bug super early and then went off to Uber. So I guess that sort of answered my next question a little bit about how you were drawn to crisis communications in the crypto space. Were you looking to get back into the industry once you, were one of the founding team members at Greenbrier?
I'm going to be interested in your take on this. And I'm sure you'll probably agree here, which is that we're super lucky so we work in the field of communications, and the fact that we're able to do it for an industry or an area that we're so passionate about makes work quite enjoyable. And it's one of those things where we're probably going to be doing some form of communications, right? That's our specialty. But to do it for an industry that you care about really gets you out of bed in the morning. And so for me, it is just, right, it's a passion for crypto and a fundamental belief in its values. If crypto accomplishes what it set out to accomplish at scale, the world will be a better place. And so, not only are we on the cutting edge of tech, but the subject is incredibly interesting. And ultimately, there's a lot of skepticism out there, as there is with any new technology. But I think we're also we're going to be on the right side of history. So it's really fun doing this work, and I think just the fact that we're able to specialize in a field that we care about is we're lucky to do it. I don't know. You may feel the same way, yeah?
I definitely, once I discovered this industry and found that there were, teams that had these like projects that were, in my opinion, going to change the world, I really wanted to be part of that. I also saw an opportunity to like really specialize in something that, there's passionate reporters too, that we're only covering this vertical. And that was interesting to me. Like, oh, wow, we can really develop authentic relationships across, at the time there weren't that many reporters covering, and now there's much more. And it's actually been fun in the past few years to sort of see the explosion of like crypto staff reporters at mainstream news outlets. I don't know if you've felt the same.
Totally have, but that's such a good point about the OGs. Like we know who they are because we've been working in this space for a long time, and they're the ones that are, personally probably bullish on the subject. They took the time to and it takes a lot of time to learn up on the industry and get as dangerous as possible without being super technical, and they had the foresight to see that this was going to be a massive area of importance and a subject matter that a lot of mainstream consumers would become interested in down the line. So it is interesting to see the growth. It's really validating. But yeah, we know who the originals are, and I really enjoy working with them.
And you're right; it is something to be said for like doing something that you're just very passionate about. This industry is crazy, and you have experience in others. So I'm curious, what are the unique sort of challenges or opportunities about doing this work in our field?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a fun one. So I think to answer it, let's first take a step back and think about why 99% of crises happen in crypto, and that's broken trust. So it doesn't really matter what the acute root cause is, right? If it's an issue with the token price, the holders expected the price to sustain or grow. If you deviate from your roadmap, your users trusted you to execute against your roadmap. If there's an outage, your users trusted your blockchain to work or your underpinning technology to work. Perception of centralization. Most projects are saying they're decentralized, so right, your users are trusting you to walk the walk. Bad or exploited tech. Again, your users trusted that your tech would work. Fraud, that's an obvious one, right? Your users are trusting you with their time, their development effort, their interest, their reputation, talking positively about your project, which is really important to do in crypto. So all of this comes back to the idea of broken trust. And if you combine that with the power of communities, you have yourself a really unique and explosive concoction for when something goes wrong. And right, the whole point of crypto was individual empowerment, and we got it, and that's great. That was, again, the whole point. But what that means is that the community is king, and they wield unprecedented power compared to Web2 consumers. They can drop your project in a second and move elsewhere. So the media is one thing, but it opens up a whole other channel of communication direct to audience, which is far more commonly required in crypto than it is in other industries. And not only that, but you have to thread the needle and find a message that will resonate with your community and the media. And I know you know this, there is a big divide between your average crypto degen and a crypto beat reporter at Fortune. And to thread the needle between those two audiences is not an easy task. And that's something that I think makes Web3 crises unique compared to the traditional tech stuff that I dealt with in the earlier years of my career.
Such a good point. Do you have two different messaging strategies for like how to communicate with the media as opposed to how to communicate in community channels? Or is it like overarching strategy similar?
You have this unique advantage that you can use to your advantage where the crypto Twitter is not necessarily reading Fortune and Fortune's not necessarily reading crypto Twitter. You can use that to your advantage in the sense that your tone can be different. The amount of details you share or not share can be different. The fundamental overarching message or response still has to be the same. You can't just completely say two different things to please two different audiences. So it's really a matter of just finding what your key messages are and then adapting it for the medium that you're choosing to communicate on. And again, it's rarely optional to not address the community when something is going sideways to the point where like the press is interested. You can be certain that your community is interested as well, and you can rarely afford to freeze either of those two groups out.
What are some common mistakes that you see companies making when they're navigating crises?
This is also a fun one. We do this crisis talk as a firm where we like to highlight 9 rules of a crisis, but I'll just call out a few of my favorites because basically breaking these rules are where the most common mistakes lie. The first one is defending the unknown. Realistically, what you think happened probably did, and so just trust your gut. Don't wish things to be true or not true. Know what you know, work with the facts that you have, and definitely do not answer any questions based on speculation. That is what sets you up for all sorts of liability and exposure down the line if you're wrong, and certainly from a reputational perspective, in addition to a potential legal or regulatory perspective. So just know what you know what you don't know, and work with what you have. The second common mistake is spinning and fluffing up facts, because facts don't need spin. And so really nothing should be said in the absence of facts. And if you don't have the facts handy, that's your most immediate objective, is to assess that and figure out what the facts are and figure out what the message is. So I think communicating too early or over communicating when the facts are on your side are both common mistakes that I see made. A third one is repeating the negative. It seems so straightforward, but if you respond to media inquiries, or if your statement includes a not with a rephrasing of the allegation, you're just restating the allegation, and that really resonates with folks who are reading your story. Literally the fewer times that the bad thing is said, the better. So communicating from a positive perspective, even in the face of a significant challenge, is pretty important. Another mistake I see is choosing the wrong spokesperson, both from a skill and title perspective. You should rarely be using your principal to deliver bad news. And look, like that's what we're here for. I'm always happy to be the spokesperson that is defiant or that is falling on the sword, right? That should rarely be the principal. There are a few edge cases where it is, but really founders should be delivering good news.
Interesting one that I hadn't really considered, honestly. Like CEOs, you don't want out there delivering any bad news.
You don't, unless it rises to the occasion. If something is critical to the project, right? That is where, of course, the CEO has to, or the founder has to step up and be willing and poised enough to handle the engagements around an issue. In almost all other instances, there is a specialist within a project or a team that probably also is a more relevant subject matter expert than the founder. And they're not the founder who, while the founder is off, developing a thought leadership platform and owning certain issues and growing the project, any type of stepping in the mud can really get in the way of those efforts. And so there is truly a way to separate those two things, and it's by having spokespeople, having comms folks that are willing to kind of get in the trenches and say what needs to be said and deliver messages that has a tone that might not necessarily fit with the brand that a founder is building for themselves.
Love it. All right, keep going. Keep going with these tactics. They're so good.
Oh, thanks. I just had one more. It's one of my favorite ones, and it's kind of after the fact. It's bad apologies. It's crazy to me that this still happens, but I see so many bad apologies. If you have to apologize, do it once, and that means that there are you're not going back in for more and rehashing the issue in your apology. You're not apologizing if somebody was offended or if your community perceived it a certain way. You're apologizing for exactly what happened, and then you're providing a clear solution or a roadmap to make the thing that you're apologizing for better. Any wiggle room within an apology kicks up a whole nother media cycle, and you have to apologize again eventually anyway. So get it right the first time, and don't apologize unless you're ready. So if you do feel like there's still some fight left and you need to counter some facts that are out there, then do that groundwork and then apologize in the end.
Great advice. How do you approach balancing transparency with confidentiality during a crisis?
So I see it as less of a balance and more of a philosophy. I think you should always be as transparent as possible without causing legal, strategic, or reputational harm. And of course, we'll talk about this, but sometimes you're extremely limited in your ability to be transparent, but I'm never really sitting there and thinking, okay, we could share this supporting fact that has no legal or reputational repercussions and doesn't compromise our strategic positioning, but I won't share it. So it's more of assessing what you have to work with and making the best of it. I think sometimes you can totally diffuse a situation with the facts and you're free to share them. That's great. You do that immediately and go wide with it. And then other times you're severely restricted with what you can say for the reasons I mentioned. So pending litigation is an example that comes straight to mind. Lawsuits make for long days. You're going to be issuing a lot of corrections, but you're not going to be saying much on the record because you're in active litigation. Everything being said is going to be, admissible evidence in court at some point if a suit carries through. So of course, there are sometimes some rock solid legal positions that are advantageous to advance. And if you have those, you're back in business. But otherwise, I find that that's a perfect example of where, right, it's not about the fact that you're not being transparent. You should always be as transparent as possible, and communities in crypto really value that. It's a matter of, is the thing I'm saying going to cause material harm to the business down the line? And in that case, you just have to kind of work with what you have.
Yeah, you mentioned clients speaking off the record. I'm curious what your experience has been with that.
Speaking off the record is a lot more complex than I think non-comms folks think it is. And I think first, starting with the rules, there's kind of two rules we like to employ with off the record. The first is that the reporter has to explicitly agree that you're off the record, which means don't just say off the record and start talking. I have seen people do this. And then the second is that not all reporters are willing to do it. And furthermore, they might burn you anyway. So there should be some pre-existing relationship or degree of trust before going off the record. That's the first disclaimer to this. Now let's set that aside. Let's assume that for the sake of this answer, the reporter's gonna honor that you're off the record and you've actually set the ground rules correctly. There's some really impactful use cases for it. The main one that comes to mind is when a reporter is planning to publish a theme or fact that is objectively false. You, as a project or the way we feel about our clients, they should not have to go on the record to fix a mistake that the reporter made or is planning to make. So you shouldn't have to issue a denial, sound defensive, repeat the negative on the record, when you can just simply explain yourself off the record and present material facts that can course correct a story. So that's one big use for off the record. And at times reporters will say, well, why do you need to go off the record? And I will say, because I'm correcting a material inaccuracy and should not have to go on the record to do that. And that actually typically ends up working. The second one is if you can kill a story entirely that is based on a false premise. And once you go on the record, reporters often have what they need to publish. So if you're on the record combating an inaccurate claim, they can go to their editor and say, Party X is saying this about a project and the project responded. Well, great. That's all you need for a story. Whereas if the entire thing is materially false, you use off the record to try to get a story pulled down altogether. Another reason is if you're cutting a deal with a reporter, you're trading scoops. You don't want that process to be exposed. And then there's two more. I guess another one is that you can materially shape the tone and opinion of a subject by sharing proprietary or inside information that relates to the story. So if, for example, a reporter is writing a story about so-and-so project is in the tank, and you have a bunch of proprietary data that proves otherwise, but you're not willing to release it publicly because you want to do that on your own terms, you go off the record to share that data with the reporter so that they understand and probably get off the ledge of calling your project a failure when in reality, right, you just want to do storytelling on your own terms. So when you have positive data, that should not be kind of issued reactively. So you maintain your control over exciting news, but you share it with a reporter to diffuse their thinking, their negative thinking on a matter. And then the last one is dropping oppo. A lot of founders, especially in crypto, it's very against the spirit of crypto to attack other projects, but sometimes it's got to get done. And the safest way to do that, fingerprints off, is just to drop oppo off the record. And it's cool to see when it's done well. It can really have a tangible impact on a project if it's done successfully against a competitor, or at least used to kind of counteract what a competitor is willing to do that you're not, as far as like attacking the opposition.
We worked on a situation together just along those lines very recently, actually. That was an interesting challenge to navigate.
We did, and there's still some oppo to drop if they want to do it.
Can you give an example? I know a lot of what you do is probably confidential, but can you give an example of a particularly challenging crisis that you've had to navigate with a client and how you approached it?
Yeah, so no, I appreciate you noting that. We really don't talk about clients that much, but sometimes there's ones that are kind of happened long ago enough, and where we have it approved and it's like a case study on our website. So those are few and far between, but one that I can totally talk about is if you'll recall, there was a crisis around the fitness tracking company Strava, where they have this really awesome feature called heat maps, where they're essentially tracking, the movement of people and objects in fitness globally, and they put it on a map so you can zoom in all the way to Bay Area, California, and see the level of activity compared to another city. Or you can come to learn that, like, in some developing country, there's like a pocket, there's a city that's like totally on Strava and into fitness, and you can see a degree of insights from it. And I think that's really cool. The problem is that members of the U.S. military were using this feature, and they had not opted out of location sharing, and they were using it to do runs and walks around secret military bases. And a researcher was able to essentially identify where U.S. operations were in countries like Syria and where their bases were, based on the fact that these members of the military were using location sharing to track their runs and rides. This obviously had a combustible ingredient, every combustible ingredient all in one. You had big tech, you had national security, you had data privacy, you had the U.S. military on foreign soil. So this was like your tailor-made headline news across like across every media outlet type of story. And I think the way that we think about knocking out a crisis it kind of goes into three buckets. The first is the messaging and the immediate strategy. You need a really rock solid communications toolkit that you can deploy across all of your channels, and you need everyone's buy-in on it as quickly as possible. So step one is, right, assess the facts. What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? And that work needs to get done really quickly. And then the second phase is the blocking and tackling. That is truly just you're in the trenches, you're tracking every story, you're issuing corrections, you're making sure your statements show up where they need to show up. You're responding to reporters, especially ones at the bigger outlets, and you're getting on the phone with them and you're kind of explaining some of the nuances. And that work, depending on how bad the issue is, can take upwards of 72 hours, where it's 3 straight days of just an influx of volume. And until you're press at inbox is clear, that phase of the crisis is not over. And then there's the third one, which is where you kind of have this wiggle room to get a bit more creative. And this kind of goes back to answering how we thought about the crisis. At some point, whether it's 2 weeks down the line, a month down the line, and you can use data to determine this, the initial wave will have subsided. And from there, you now need to engage in some reputational recovery. So what does that look like? Well, it usually has to involve a lot of access with a friendly reporter where you kind of let them inside, and it has to be some type of material change that addresses what happened previously and why it won't happen again. And then it requires some type of news hook to help everyone turn the page and get excited about the project or the company again. So in the case of Strava, it was changing the policy to opt in instead of needing to opt out of location sharing. And then it was an exclusive around that policy change. And then some really exciting data that, indicated the company's momentum and upward trajectory. And that all packaged into a clean, exclusive story that created kind of a 10, 14-day tail of little inflection points off of that. And of course, we still are aware of what happened. We're talking about it right now. It was a really interesting story. But it really, that type of execution is the best you can ask for. When you get that story at the end, that really helps folks focus on the next thing. And then you're back to business from there. So that's typically how we think about kind of the three buckets of managing a crisis anyway, and how it was applied to a really sticky situation.
How do you know when it's time for the resetting of the narrative conversation? When did you know that, okay, I think that the dust has settled a bit here and we're ready to sort of shop this exclusive?
It's a great question. I think data is key here. You can literally see when the volume is dissipating. So if you have the correct queries and you're kind of scraping volume, sentiment, all of the different, aggregations across press and social, you can determine when the volume's starting to trail off and when the negative story or narrative at hand comprises, less than a percentage of total volume associated with the project. So you can use data to inform that decision. And usually this happens in about 2 to 3 weeks, unless you're dealing with a true business ender. I think that feature story can hit within, 2 to 3 weeks. And I think, as I mentioned, it's a completely open process, deep access from a reporter with a news hook. And then I think another thing that's really overlooked as far as resetting the narrative and quickly recovering from a crisis is to turn marketing back on. So often companies go quiet because they're kind of shell-shocked when something bad happens. And it's totally understandable for the first couple of days, it would be kind of tone deaf to communicate otherwise. But as soon as you hit that point where volume is down and you're starting to see this baseline as this light at the end of the tunnel, crank up the marketing, start running your ads, start doing your thing again. And that is actually creating volume that further pushes the crisis or the bad thing that happened to the back of folks' minds. So again, we're pretty aggressive in recommending when our clients start kind of turning back on the machine, if you will, especially if they have the budget and the resources to do so, because it just goes a long way in helping folks move on from the crisis.
Can you share what tools you use to track the sentiment?
We use Meltwater. We've used all of them. I think they're all okay. Sorry if anyone's listening.
We use Meltwater too. That's why I was curious. I was wondering if there's a better.
Whoever solves the social listening sentiment stuff and whoever solves video conferencing, those two individuals one day are going to be worth 10 billion plus each. But yeah, it's fine. It does what it needs to do. I think that like anything, it's a tool in the toolkit. It's not the end all be all. I think the key when you're using social listening software is to have a consistent methodology. So if you're doing the same thing, then the trends become meaningful. Whether or not the computer can detect whether sarcasm is actually negative sentiment, right? That's kind of besides the point when what you're looking for is trends that move the needle. And if you're employing the same methodology, you can get a degree of accuracy by doing it that way, at least from a macro perspective.
You touched on this earlier, but can you discuss the role of social media and community channels in crisis comms and how to effectively use them as tools?
It's not only essential for direct to audience comms, which, as we noted, is not optional in crypto to maintain trust, but you can use it to bypass direct media engagement and control your message. And this means just responding by pointing reporters to your direct communication. So there's times where it doesn't make sense to give the light of day to a story that's going to run in the press when you're already handling it directly with your community and you feel like it's moving in the right direction and you're on the verge of resolving it. So in that case, your entire comms is on social. And when reporters are sending inquiries, you're not validating their story and giving them the statement they need so that their editor can tell them they can run the story. You're just pointing to a link that you've already used to resolve the issue. So that's one example where social media is really important in a crisis and where it can we really be used to your advantage. I
thought it was interesting. I mean, obviously the first domino to fall in the FTX implosion that happened was the CoinDesk article by Ian Allison that, exposed the Alameda balance sheet and the holes in it. But then watching that play out in real time on Twitter between the leading characters was really fascinating to watch. And you did see almost the news happening first on Twitter and then in the media.
You're totally right. And it was the very principles involved with it going back and forth and leaking each other's, Telegram conversations. It was quite the sight to unfold. And furthermore with Twitter, you're so right about the news moving quickly. It's because there's less of a filter, of course, and there's so many smart researchers in crypto on Twitter that are actually finding scoops on chain and just publishing it. And I think reporters are increasingly relying on those people on Twitter for their scoops. So it's the blessing and a curse. It's such a powerful amplifier and momentum generator for projects, and yet it's also where false information can spread, or where accurate but damaging information can spread like wildfire. It's just a totally new dynamic to even what it looked like 3-4 years ago.
Totally. We use it as such a tool and inroads to reporters. Like they're flagging things that they want on Twitter, and we can have our clients hop into that conversation in real time. So it's definitely an opportunity too.
I feel like you do that really well. That's not something that I think about doing enough at all. How do you do that? Do you just kind of know who to follow, or are you in their DMs?
We're constantly tracking what's happening on crypto Twitter as it relates to the reporters and influencers in the sector and what they're looking for. So we use it for our proactive kind of efforts and try to break into, we sort of canvas, okay, what is the news cycle going to look like this week? Is this something that's going to last, or is it something that's like a day-long news cycle? And then how can we plug our clients into the conversation? So we'll flag things to our clients and say, hey, this reporter's talking about X, can you hop into that? And then it's just another touch point, like they're hearing from us on the pitch side, but they're also seeing the actual expert commenting on their thread. It's good to have multiple touch points to get their attention, I think.
That's super smart. That makes total sense.
Yeah. What advice would you give to early stage crypto companies about how they can have like a preemptive crisis plan in place?
I would say that you need a plan generally. And so many crises are inevitable and predictable. So when you know that something, just due to the sheer nature of Web3 and how fragile some of the technology can be and how communities can be, and knowing that you're kind of in a high risk space, why would you ever sit on that knowledge without getting ahead of it? You can do so much before something happens, and you can anticipate that very thing is going to happen just by the nature of the industry, that you can have somewhat of a strategy. You're never going to nail the exact issue and how it manifests perfectly, but you can have your response teams in place. You can have your general opinion on how you're going to respond to certain types of issues. And so this is sort of a shameless plug for what we do, but we have a standalone offering that does exactly this, where we'll go into a project and we'll interview everyone we can get a hold of, from the founders down to the heads of key teams, and we'll just ask them what keeps them up at night. We'll compile a list of 40 to 50 what we'll call vulnerabilities. And when I say vulnerability, I mean like we're not smart enough to analyze your smart contract, but we're looking for vulnerabilities from a reputational perspective. And of that list of 40 to 50, let's say 20 of them are preventable upfront with recommendations. The first half of our audits are going to provide those recommendations. And then let's say the other 20 are just inevitable. If you're managing user accounts, there's going to be phishing attacks. How do you communicate around a phishing attack, and how do you support users, and what are your thresholds to responding or not? All these things can be defined. You know that there's going to be a phishing attack on your platform. It's just the nature of crypto. And so let's have a plan for that. And for those, we write, full-blown communications playbooks down to recommended messaging tactics, social media messaging, stakeholder engagement, crisis recovery. We just want to kind of help clients think through what is this going to look like, and how do we most effectively manage it when the inevitable hits. So I think that's how I think about crisis. It amazes me that there are so many projects in the space where when something goes wrong that was so predictable, they're just starting from square one, and there's really no need. Speed is key. We talked about how quickly information spreads throughout crypto Twitter. If you can respond in 1 hour because you have a preset plan versus taking 8 hours to write it up and to have everyone buy into it, you already have a huge leg up. So I think it goes a long way in kind of catching these snowballs before they get out of control, and get out of control super quickly on Twitter.
Yeah, and try not to break trust, because as you mentioned, like, it's always about trust being broken in one way or another. But yes,
exactly.
I always say that our business is all about like meeting or exceeding expectations, but how do you manage expectations, especially during a crisis when like emotions are running high? Obviously it's not something that they've been looking for. It's a tricky situation. How do you like navigate managing those expectations and given the sort of fast-paced nature of crypto?
For sure, it's such a great question, and I think one thing to keep in mind is that everybody on the client side has different levels of understanding of how comms work. And in the meantime, typically our point person is going to be, a head of comms, a VP of marketing, and they're responsible in not only overseeing us and working with us to manage the crisis, but then reporting it and messaging it up to the founders and those who they report directly to. So I think the first step is kind of thinking about those internal dynamics and being really considerate of them, and helping your point person, who ultimately, right, is the one who's determining whether or not to work with you or not in most cases. Helping them look good is really important, and there are a few ways to do that. I think the first is to predict what's going to happen with accuracy, and that's just after years of dealing with these, you end up kind of getting pretty good at the pattern recognition side of things. So we can typically, when a client gets really direct with us and says, how bad is this? We usually have a pretty confident answer when we say, you're going to be fine. Let's just do these two things, or this is going to be a rough few days. Buckle up, right? Like being really honest up front around how bad something is or not goes a long way, so that there's no kind of misaligned client expectations. I think using data to make your case is really important. That's just reporting as much as you sense is needed. This always goes into kind of the bucket of over communicating. Do you want to do end of day reports at the bare minimum that just kind of provides a snapshot of what work has been done, where everything stands, what you're still chasing down, and managing a media cycle. But sometimes even 2 to 3 times per day helps. Also in the over communication bucket is just giving them access to everything you're drafting, tracking, and working on, so that at any time they can check in without having to bother you. You're probably super busy actually putting out the fire. They can check in and just get a snapshot of where things stand. So it seems so basic, but our core tool, in addition to that initial messaging doc that everyone needs to buy in on, that messaging strategy doc, is just to have a press tracker where every story is being fed into this thing in real time. And then it has a notes column with that shows exactly what we're executing on. The notes might say this story is fine. This story has an editorialization on page 3. We're working to get in touch with this reporter. This story was corrected. We changed this headline. And so that at any point in time, the client not only sees the needle moving, but they know that you're working hard around the clock to sort these issues. And then the fourth thing is celebrating your wins. The reality is some of the best work in a crisis never sees the light of day. And that's because you've killed a story, you've cut off a media cycle, you made it wind down faster than you initially expected to. So I think points 1 and 4 are really similar in the sense that if you predict with a degree of accuracy up front, and then you exceed those expectations, you should absolutely make note that you've done so. Like I said, that nobody out there is going to see a story that was never written, but that's some of the best work that can possibly be done when you're mitigating a crisis.
Such a good point. I love that. And I love that you also, earlier you mentioned like usually when someone's gut is that something is true, it usually is. I think it's interesting that you use your own kind of pulse check just based on experience about like how bad this is, and you can navigate that, accurately.
Totally. I think clients, you just got to keep in mind they're having one of the worst days of their professional careers if we're in the trenches putting out a full-blown crisis media cycle. And part of that is just helping them diagnose what's happening and what they can expect, and doing it in a really human way. Just saying this is going to be rough, but here's the plan, or this is going to be mostly fine. Here's the plan. Don't overreact. Don't go say something stupid on Twitter. We got this, right? Like all of that type of initial touch point can come in a lot of ways, but we find that clients, founders, they really appreciate that first gut check.
In our industry, where do you get your news? Like, how do you keep up to date with all of the moving parts of crypto? And also, how do you have time?
Totally. Well, I would love your take on this as well. I think our day-to-day work certainly helps. That goes without saying. We don't really have a choice. And so when you don't have a choice to do something and it's critical of your business to do it, you do it. But I also think that both of our firms have a unique opportunity to touch almost every corner of the industry during any given week. And that makes it kind of hard to not know what's happening. And sometimes, right, it's not that we would ever use inside information to inform strategies, across other client accounts or any of that. But we generally get to work with, we do some DeFi, we do some layer 1, we do some NFT. And so you do some institutional, you get this opportunity to kind of understand what's going on in every corner. And I think that helps a lot. So a lot of it, we're lucky, a lot of it happens organically. There's also the reporter relationship side of things. If you're constantly having conversations with the reporters and just kind of having these what do you got? Cool. Okay. I knew that. I didn't know that. Just those types of gut checks. Those are great ways of picking up information. And then there's of course the data and analytics side of things, but really it's kind of just about feel to understand kind of what matters or what doesn't. I don't know, what do you think about that one? It's a good question.
I think our team is using similar tools. I mean, we definitely use crypto Twitter as a pulse and kind of a directive as to what news is actually getting traction, and what the news cycle is looking like that week. I would say that's probably the best tool, because we're following all of the reporters across different, we're working with obviously all the reporters across the crypto trade publications, but also those that cover the speed at more mainstream news outlets. And I think you're right to your point about crypto is such a broad umbrella now, and there's so many different buckets under that umbrella that having clients in different areas and with different areas of focus gives you kind of a holistic view of the industry and the news for sure.
Yep, totally agree.
But we have people on our team that basically are specifically focused on making sure that they are keeping everyone kind of up to speed with what is trending in the news and how we can be proactive that week.
That's important. I think that makes total sense that you have that in place.
What qualities and skills do you think are essential for someone to do this type of work? Crisis, comms, and PR in crypto?
I would have an easier time hiring for a crypto practice that does specifically full stack, but needs to understand the space well. The team I have is incredible, but we're probably going to be looking to grow it soon. And I'm just thinking about how I'm going to find that person. But really what it is it's the prerequisites for anyone working in comms applies. So the intuition, the pattern recognition, and just being a good writer. and a good communicator. Set that aside because that's, I think, a prerequisite for everyone. When it comes to crisis specifically, it's some of the traits are fast working, calm under pressure, decisiveness. And then I think the one that especially our generation doesn't do very well, like the older generation did, is just picking up the phone and calling someone and having a conversation and having a tough conversation and being a bit confrontational. You cannot solve a crisis over email, and you cannot kill a story over email, and you cannot influence an opinion of a reporter over email, nor can you do so in a way that doesn't put confidential information in writing. So the phone is just, it's such a lost art, but it's so essential. And whoever's working on a crypto crisis needs to be willing to hit the phones and do it aggressively and really work the phones and talk to have a bunch of touch points with reporters who are all involved in a crisis media cycle. To me, that last piece is hard to find. Just folks who are willing to do that,
That's a great tip. Use the phone, learn to love the phone.
Yes. Once again, we grew up loving the phone and then we don't need it anymore. But I think this is a use case where you can make the case for it.
How do you see the role of PR evolving in our industry over the next few years?
I think there's more channels than the press, and you need to get good at all of them. And that's not to mention the traditional media is shrinking and dispersing to other platforms, which means that the number of fluffy stories and opportunities that are out there are simply less than there were 2 to 3 years ago. The competition for the attention of those reporters who are still kind of have this editorial discretion and are kind of able to pursue the stories they want and can be favorable for clients, those are fewer and farther between, and again, the competition is fierce. And so that makes a few things really important. That makes owned content and controlling the message crucial. We, at this point, are now putting content creation and copywriting into almost all of our proposals that go to clients, just because if there's a week or 2 week stretch where we can't deliver the type of coverage that our clients are looking for, well, we're still using our time and we're creating something that's valuable. We're running your blog or your newsroom, or we're just cranking content for you and developing kind of thought leadership pieces. That I think own content and content creation is going to be really important for our space moving forward. And then there's the big elephant in the room. There's ChatGPT and there's AI writing tools. And so we actually, a couple of weeks ago, we were all in New York for a company retreat, the Greenbrier team, and I led a hour-long group discussion where we did a couple group breakouts, and the end output of that was actually devising a company policy around our use of AI. And at face value, when you hear that these AI writing tools are out there, well, then what do we need the comms folks for? And our policy was really exploring, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities that this technology presents? And what we ultimately concluded is that we should be using it as much as possible to streamline our work, make us more efficient without compromising the quality of it. And we're going to do it in an ethical way. And we're going to always tell our clients, we're going to tell them that we have a policy, and we're going to tell them what the policy is if we're asked. And our policy is really just use it to the max extent possible. Don't ever submit anything. So if you want to use it for like a creative spark or as a conversation starter, or just to kind of unstick yourself when you're trying to write something, then totally use it. You just need to rewrite it. And if you use ChatGPT to help with anything you created, you need to run it through OpenAI's classifier to make sure that it detects it as 100% human written. And it's so interesting how every firm has their own kind of take on it. I think the media is being really friendly towards it because they don't want to come off as defensive or threatened, but it's a real thing. It's out there. It can make you more efficient, but on the other hand, if used incorrectly, it can undermine your credibility and your reputation. So to us, we're very early on keeping track of what's happening in AI and developing really clear policies around its use and how we communicate it. What about you? Where are you on the AI ChatGPT craze?
I mean, I think it sounds like you have a much more fleshed out policy around it. We haven't really had internal discussions about how to use it. We've been playing around with, I think, using it as a point of inspiration to get unstuck, like you mentioned. I think it's helpful to have a starting point for that, but it certainly hasn't replaced our work in any way. And a lot of what we're doing is very deliberate outreach, human-to-human connection. We have real authentic relationships with the reporters, and we're pitching real stories in real time. And I don't think that AI can replace that ever, but it can certainly make you, I totally agree with everything you said around the policy. And I might, grab some of it and use it for us, because I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that it can definitely be a tool to make us more efficient. But I don't think there's any replacing sort of the human-to-human element that goes this sort of like delicate relationship between PR people and reporters.
Totally agree. I think the relationships are what's going to keep us separate and not threatened by AI. And I think the other thing too is the tone and the writing. This stuff is good, but they're not better writers than like the folks on my team. Like AI text is not as good as the text that my team's able to write. And I'm sure you feel the same way about yours. And furthermore, it really does a bad job of adapting tone. Well, it doesn't. It has one tone. It's a robot. So for us, right, we're the ultimate chameleons. We're putting ourselves across multiple clients, multiple industries, different brand voices, and crafting our writing tailored to those brand voices. AI is so far away from being able to do that it really, it's helpful. It can fact check. It can generate data points quickly. It can condense a paragraph. You can tell it to like cut out the fluff and don't lose the point. And it'll spit something out that's half as long as what you wrote. It has some uses for sure, but it's certainly not at a point where I think it's a threat. I think it's an opportunity.
It can't pick up the phone and call people.
It cannot pick up the phone and call people. Yeah, it actually can it. That saw some deep fake stuff that was pretty convincing. Didn't a Wall Street Journal reporter get past her bank's security program by putting a deep fake on the phone with like another robot that authenticated the user from the bank side? Anyway, I saw something like that. Pretty scary stuff.
That is pretty scary. When you mentioned the owned content, are you talking about op-eds or, what type of content, or blog posts? Like, give examples of what you're talking about for that.
Yeah, really anything that a project would write and put out into the world that's public facing. We're really quickly pulling together the resources and the skills needed to write all of that for our content, for our clients. So it could be an op-ed. It could be LinkedIn, Twitter threads. It certainly can be running a project's blog post or blog or newsroom, and having that steady stream of content coming in each week on the client calls and talking about it, receiving feedback, brainstorming the next slate of content. All of that work is all bucketed under content to me, and it's a way that, like, as the media becomes more competitive and it's harder to get those like positive stories all the time, helping define the client's voice and stake them out as thought leaders through their own channels, and being the kind of the spearheads of that goes a long way in adding value.
Well, I really want to thank you so much for this conversation. You've given so many tactical tips and so much great information. I've worked with you in the trenches, so I know that you're the real deal, and you really have incredible expertise and calm in these crisis situations. So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. And I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts or anything else you want to share with the audience.
Well, first of all, you are too kind. I really loved doing this. This was quite an enjoyable conversation, and I'm happy to do this again anytime. So just let me know. And we certainly feel the same way about the Melrose team. Really love working with you all. I don't know if I have any closing thoughts beyond the fact that, again, we're just so lucky to be working in crypto, and I'm super bullish on it. I again love doing this today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Abram. Thanks for tuning in to Proof of PR. This episode was brought to you by Melrose PR, a leading provider of communications and PR strategy for Bitcoin and Web3 innovators. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you listen today. To stay up to date on upcoming guests and news, visit proofofpr.com or follow us on Twitter @proofofpr. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and hodling.